Okay, so the first thing to say, just to give you a little bit of background, is that open educational resources are just a massive swathe of types of things, if you like, and they come in all different sizes. So, for example, at one end of the spectrum there might be a full module that would be in something like the Open University's OpenLearn platform, all the way through to perhaps a single image that somebody would pick up from maybe a service like Flickr and place into a lecture or into a PowerPoint. So it's a vast area in that sense. Open educational resources, a strict definition of them, tends to include the idea of an open license being attached to them, like Creative Commons, for example, and that allows people to legally take resources, duplicate them, put them in their own spaces online, potentially edit or repurpose them. And for some of the people that we spoke to, this was very important. They tended to be the people who were reusing in a visible way in the name of the institution. So it was something that had the institution's reputation attached to it. So an example of that would be somebody who was perhaps producing an online module that they were going to use with students or that they were going to re-release out onto the web, and they'd construct that by reusing smaller pieces of OER and constructing them into a larger structure. And that's where the licensing became very important, because it was attached to institutional reputation. Now, having said that, the majority of people that we spoke to, in this case mainly the academic staff, saw open educational resources in a much more flexible way, and to them it was the educational aspects of the resources, not surprisingly, which were more important to them. So how relevant they were to their program of study, whether they solved a particular teaching problem. They weren't necessarily considering licensing. They were very respectful of the idea of citing where the resource came from, but they weren't necessarily looking at it in a strict legal sense. One of the key messages that came out of the study, that came from tutors, but especially from students, was the value of collating lists or embedding resources into spaces like virtual learning environments. Now, students recognised, especially early stage students, that they couldn't necessarily critically evaluate the search return from something like Google. They didn't know whether they were going to be wasting their time looking at maybe irrelevant or inaccurate sources. And so they wanted to go somewhere trusted. They wanted to go somewhere where there were just a simple list of resources that tutors had put together that they knew were valid and relevant. And although that isn't particularly pedagogically glamorous, it was the case that students kind of expected this and really appreciated it and took advantage of it. So that's one specific example of reuse, but obviously there are different forms of reuse in different contexts. It's, as I say, a large space. So that led us to create this sort of map of the reuse landscape. Now, out of our data, quite a lot of the activity was in that independent quadrant, but most of it was where the independent quadrant blurs into the strategic or the appropriated. Okay, so this is what I was just talking about in terms of gathering together resources in virtual learning environments. We did also find activity in that ratified quadrant. There was less of that, proportionally speaking, and it could be the case that that's because that kind of activity is done by more specific kind of production teams rather than necessarily those people who are, you know, at the coalface of day-to-day teaching.